Well, thanks for your patience, everyone. Sorry about the delay, but between the weather and the sort of labyrinth that we've all found through, hopefully everyone made it safe and in the right place. Just a bit of housekeeping, there are still some bathrooms open. If you just take a door out, go to the right, head straight on through if anyone needs to do that. While we're doing a bit of housekeeping, so the speakers here tonight will be speaking some prepared remarks. They'll have some discussion between them, and then they'll go to Q&A. So if I could just ask everyone to hold their questions until that section. And otherwise, I might start off. So I'll probably start by introducing Platypus. So the Platypus Affiliated Society was established in December 2006. It organises reading groups, public fora, research and journalism focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the old, the 1920s and 30s, the new, 1960s and 70s, post-political, 1980s and 90s, and millennial, 2000s and 2010s, left for the possibility of an emancipatory politics today. If you are interested in finding out more, you can check it out in the platypus1917.org, or you can see our Instagram, Platypus New Zealand. If it's the one that has shoes on it, that's not us. If it's the one with like pictures of Lenin and stuff, then that's us. That's us. We're those ones. We run we have a weekly reading group, as well as on-campus coffee breaks, which is sort of more casual fora for discussion, as well as film screenings, teach-ins, and panels like this one tonight. So we also have Shit Platypus Says, which is a podcast, if anyone engaged with those, as well as the Platypus Review, which is a monthly open access journal, so anyone can publish to it, and up to and including myself and also Michael. We have one of the most recent edition where we interview Helen Hindperry, the lead writer of Disco Elysium, if that interests anyone here. So I think that covers that. I may introduce the speakers, I think. Is that right? Yes. Speakers first? Sure. So first we're hearing from John Minto, who's a political activist best known for his role in the anti-apartheid movement as the national organiser for HART, which is Halt All Racist Tours, during the protests against the 1981 Springbok tour in New Zealand. He's currently the national chair for the Palestine Solidarity Network, Aotearoa. And then we have Scott Hamilton, who's a sociologist and historian. His books include The Crisis of Theory, The Stolen Island, and Go South Road. He's currently, actually I'll skip the session right after. And finally we have Patrick Tan, who's a student at the University of Auckland, having just completed his undergraduate degree in sociology and education. He's the Secretary of Working Students of Aotearoa, the WSA, an anti-imperialist student organisation based in the University of Auckland that aims to educate and organise students around issues faced by students and oppressed peoples globally. Cool. So,
Skip the rest.
Did I miss anything?
You can skip the rest.
Oh, okay. Very good. Cool. So I'll just quickly read out the panel prompt that the speakers will be referring to, and then we'll move on to that. On various fronts, such as Ukraine, Palestine and China, the left invokes the rallying cry of imperialism to oppose or support the actions of various state powers. In the past few months, this cry has been further raised in response to Trump's proposed annexations of Greenland, the Panama Canal, and Canada to the United States. Such a cry evokes many disparate historical memories on the left, including the protests against the 2000s War on Terror, NATO intervention in Bosnia, the Falklands War, the Vietnam War, and World War I, which Marxists called the Imperialist War. Understanding what, if anything, these historical moments have in common raises the need to clarify this category of imperialism. In light of these tensions, Platypus asks, 1. What is imperialism? 2. Does overcoming imperialism mean to overcome capitalism? Does overcoming capitalism mean to overcome imperialism? 3. How did the Marxist critique of imperialism differ from liberal or right-wing critiques? 4. Has the concept of imperialism or its significance been clarified in the centuries since Lenin's famous pamphlet? And if so, how? And 5. why is imperialism being raised now? Cool. So if we could just go straight through, and I'd like to introduce John Minto, please.
Kia ora. Kia ora koutou. Inga mana, inga reo, inga tangata whenua o tēnei rohi, Ngāti Whātua, inga hoi whā. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Greetings, everybody, and a special thank you, first of all, to Michael and Jamie for, on behalf of the Platypus Society, for inviting me here. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what our other two panellists say. So imperialism, 10 minutes. What do you reckon? Imperialism, 10. Well, this is my 10 minutes worth, okay? Imperialism in 10 minutes. So I think essentially imperialism is very simple. It's the process of extending a state's influence well beyond its borders to gain political or economic advantage for its capitalist businesses. Now, I really want to emphasise that the benefits of imperialism go to capitalist businesses. So if you look at the greatest imperial power today, the US, which has its tentacles stretching across the globe, do the people of America benefit from what the US is doing? 45 million Americans, the last figure I saw, living in poverty. I mean, abject poverty. 45 million. My argument is that the benefits go to what Martin Bradbury on the Daily Blog says, the 1% capitalists and the 9% enablers that help them to get rich. The 90% don't benefit from it. And I think the same thing applies just in the case of imperialism. So the US, so in other words, I just emphasise that the economic benefits accrue to the capitalist businesses. They don't accrue to the host country's population as a whole. And of course, imperialism is tied in with the need to extend your markets and to gain resources for your business, right? Extend markets and gain resources. Capitalism would collapse without growth. Capitalism needs growth, and if it doesn't have growth, it will die. So part of the role of imperialism is to extend those markets and to gain the resources. And it's also a case, even if you don't particularly need a particular resource, you can control the flow of that resource to your friends and away from your enemies, which is what happens in the Middle East over oil. America's taken a lot of action in the Middle East not because America needs the oil itself, because it doesn't, but it wants to get that oil controlled and have it flow to its enemy, to its friends and away from its enemies. So typical patterns of imperialism over the last 500 years or so have seen really grubby little deals done with a local elite in the global south, or countries that have resources that the imperial power wants. Grubby little deals are done with an elite, again, not for the benefit of the people of that country as a whole. It's for the benefit of the capitalist corporation, first of all, and the local elite are very good at providing, facilitating that process. And of course, we have it here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where we have successive governments who provide all kinds of access to different things in New Zealand, investments and what have you. Again, we've had increasing levels of poverty in New Zealand. None of this foreign investment that comes in is actually benefiting the people of New Zealand. It benefits a very small number of people who've become obscenely wealthy at the expense of the majority. So in general, the global south has been seen simply as a vast resource for capitalist enterprises. So I've got a book at home and it's called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And it was written, I think, in the 1970s. And it's just like a picture of how Africa has been used as a resource base. no sense of international development, no sense of building democracy, building civil society, simply there to exploit the resources of the country. So that's what imperialism does. It's not there to provide great benefits for the people who live in the country. Just extending that a little bit further. So how have these how do these imperial states justify what they do? Well, it's the window dressing they use. It's about it's for their own good. For these indigenous people, for these brown people, it's for their own good. We're bringing them civilization, we're bringing Christianity, we're bringing democracy. And if you just think about that for just 2 seconds, the US has spent far more time destroying democracy in the world than it has building democracy. The US does not want democracy. It's never wanted democracy. It will support any leaders, provided they support US objectives. So across Central America, South America, through Africa, through the Middle East, the US has a whole history of year after year smashing democracies, smashing the development of civil society, bombing the hell out of countries so that you end up with factions fighting each other in endless civil wars like you have in Libya and in Syria. So don't buy the argument about democracy. I'm not saying that you people in this room would buy that argument, but I was going to say at the start actually that there's some people in this room I know who know a lot more about imperialism than I do, and I'm sure they'll have some questions and some comments of their own later on. So the people of Greenland and Canada, America wants to take over Greenland and Canada. Do you think the people of Canada and the people of Greenland want to have a US version of democracy? Do they want Christianity? Do they want to be civilized? No, this is a naked power grab. It's a way to preserve what the US has and to control the US what the people the US sees as their enemies, particularly Russia, by developing even more military bases and what have you around the world. So, which leads to another key point. Imperialism is always enforced by military means. So, if you just think about how many countries the US has bombed or invaded since the Second World War, I didn't bother looking up the number because it's not important. It's just a huge number. Just as a small aside here, my wife was reading something on the internet the other day and she said, did you know that there's only 26 countries in the world that Britain didn't invade? I says, hell, they failed. They didn't get all the 26. That's a statement of really what imperialism is, isn't it? And tied in with imperialism is racism. It's the strongly European view of the world, and a view that says that technological advancement implies social advancement, implies a greater sense of civilized development, if you like. But of course, none of those things stand up to any scrutiny. So the US at the moment is a waning global power, and I think history will show, in 100 years' time, people will say America was at its peak in the mid-1990s after the fall of the Berlin Wall and after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And at that point, America had the option of abandoning NATO. Could have abandoned NATO. NATO could have collapsed. They already had developing capitalist economy in Russia, and they could simply have sort of let it go. But when you've got vast swathes of your economy depending on military production, it's very hard to just say, oh well, we're not going to have any more wars. I mean, it's if you've got an economy based on military production, you need enemies. You've got to have enemies. You've got to have an axis of evil. You've got to have terrorists popping up everywhere. You've got to be waging war on drugs, war on terror, war on whatever, war on brown people. When America Have I?
1 minute.
1 minute, okay, that's fine. So I think the US elites at the moment feel the real need, desperate need, to expand their sort of capitalist enterprises, more so than at many times in the past. And so we've got this, because it's a failing state. Always, when you have failing, waning states, you always get much more extreme reactions that, or extreme leaders, extreme positions, and Trump sort of exemplifies all of that. So I was going to say something about tariffs, but I won't do that later. So you might remember back in the So the other questions, right? That was the question: what is capitalism? Very quickly, does overcoming imperialism mean to overcome capitalism? Does overcoming capitalism mean to overcome imperialism? Yes, and yes are the two answers. Those are joined at the hip. How does the Marxist critique differ from liberal and right-wing ones? Well, I've sort of said that. I think the Marx one focuses on the economic imperatives of imperialism, whereas the other critiques, like liberal and even right-wing critiques, focus on the civilization and democracy and for their own good kind of arguments. And has the concept of imperialism or its significance changed? I think we've simply seen the monopoly of imperialism by the world's great hegemon, the US. The US is now our biggest terrorist state, and it's defending its control of the world economy and the world's resources, and using military means to do so. Lastly, what is the antidote to imperialism? Just two words: international solidarity. That's the antidote, right? The antidote comes, so all of the work we do in solidarity at the moment in Palestine, solidarity with Palestine, solidarity with workers, solidarity with people's struggles the world over. That is ultimately the antidote to capitalism, and that's what we'll see the end of it, and that's what we'll see the end of imperialism. Kia ora koutou.
Thank you, John. Next up, we will have Scott Hamilton and his prepared marks.
Oh, thanks. Kia ora, everyone. And nice to be here, although actually I was, as I came in this building, my mind was drifting back to C.K. Stead's great novel, Smith's Dream, which, of course, was the basis for the movie Sleeping Dogs. And I don't know if anyone remembers, but Jesperson, the secret policeman in that novel who interrogates and tortures the hero, he's actually set up his torture headquarters here in the Maths and Physics building. This is the headquarters of the secret police. So quite a sort of scary thought, especially in view of what's going on in America at the moment. I hope we don't end up in that dystopia.
Just down the corridor here.
Is that? Yeah.
Right.
And acknowledge this is the rohi of Ngāti Whātua, people who have their own history of anti-imperialism. It was really great doing some research on their links with the Cook Islands and struggles that were lost in parts of Aotearoa, one in the Cooks, partly because of the links that they established, the maritime links, the trading links in the 19th century. Yeah, I mean, my life's been even more disorganised than normal lately. I've been looking after my mother because she's 87 and she hasn't been well, so I've been living with her mostly for the last few weeks. But one of the fun things we've been doing is actually going through the old photo albums, family photo albums, and it got me thinking about imperialism in terms of family history. There's a photo I pulled out of one of the albums, and it shows a whole bunch of my maternal ancestors standing in kilts in the Australian outback sometime in the late 1800s, and they were probably talking to each other in Gaelic. And that's one of those bizarre juxtapositions that imperialism creates. I'm probably like a lot of Pākehā in that both my maternal and my paternal ancestors were refugees from imperialism. But as well as being refugees, they were also emissaries of imperialism, and in some sense they might have been shock troops of imperialism. My mother, her people were driven out of the Isle of Skye during the Highland clearances. So you have capitalism, entering its anabolic stage, the mode of production. They want more profit. Landowners are becoming moving from a sort of more feudal setup towards becoming capitalist bosses. They want to run sheep. Sheep are more profitable than people. And these peasants basically on the Isle of Skye are pushed out. And they have the choice, going into factories, becoming part of the rising industrial proletariat, or going to the other end of the world. So they go to Australia, and they become a landless people who take the land of another Indigenous people. Similar story for my father's side. They are refugees, or they were refugees from the revolutionary turmoil in the countryside in England and Ireland in the 1870s, the so-called revolt of the fields, that's what historians call it, where you have the globalisation of agriculture, you have competition from America, and you have farmers, often just leases of land rather than owners of land, unable to pay for their leases, unable to sell their crops, and you have occupations, you have boycotts, you have strikes, and these people are eventually driven towards countries like New Zealand. Rollo Arnold wrote a very important study about the synergy between the blacklisted and defeated agricultural workers and the New Zealand government. New Zealand government sent recruiters to get these workers who had no future in Britain and to bring them here. And Joseph Arch, who was the leader in England of the agricultural workers, I think of him as the Moses of the Pākehā people, because he said to his members, he said, there's no future here, go to the Promised Land. And the Promised Land was Aotearoa. And once again, you have this paradox where a landless people take the land of another people. It plays out again and again in the history of imperialism. We see it playing out in a ferocious and exceptionally tragic way in Israel and Palestine at the moment. We can look at someone like Lenin or Luxemburg, another writer, to see the economic formulae which help to explain these awesome events and these shifts, these movements, these migrations. There's also a cultural explanation. Imperialism comes to saturate the way that my ancestors think and feel. It manifests on every level of culture. And there's a New Zealand historian who's written well about this. He has a book called Webs of Empire, Tony Ballantyne. And if you think of the British Empire as a web, and people moving like spiders around that web, from Scotland to Australia, from Northern Ireland to New Zealand, in case of my paternal ancestors. And there are many supporting strands in that web. And some of the strands in that web are surprising. Karl Marx, in his most famous text, the Communist Manifesto. I remember when I joined a Marxist group when I was young, and I was given this book to read, and I thought, here we go, here's the blueprint for the perfect society, and I opened it up, and what did I discover? Passage after passage in the first section of the manifesto in praise of capitalism. The creative destruction that capitalism was wreaking, the way that the depredations of capitalism was setting the way for the proletariat to take power and become the gravediggers of capitalism. And Marx alludes to joyfully to imperialist aggression and conflict in the manifesto. He alludes to the Opium Wars when he talks about destroying the Chinese walls of backwardness. He refers to the idiocy and backwardness of rural life being destroyed in an allusion to what the British were doing in India. And so imperialism saturates this text. By the time Marx went to write a preface for the Russian translation, the 1882 Russian translation of the manifesto, in the last year of his life, he had a somewhat different perspective. He'd become much less confident about the destructive potential of capitalism, especially after the failure of the Paris Commune in 1871. He'd been studying so-called peripheral societies, the Iroquois Federation, Algeria, and above all the Russian peasant commune. And his final writings temper his vision a lot and present the possibility of a very different transition to socialism. These writings aren't so well known, unfortunately. But for me, a moment where my perspective on the web of imperialism changed is when I was working on, I wrote my PhD thesis and a book about the great English Marxist historian E.P. Thompson. He was a historian, he was a peace campaigner, he was a really bad poet as well. He was a man of many parts, an incredible guy, and it was a privilege to be able to meet some of his friends and his widow, Dorothy, and to work on this book. And Thompson's most famous book, The Making of the English Working Class, it really describes what my ancestors and maybe some of your ancestors went through. It describes being thrown off the land. It describes the grim factory towns and the lives they lived there, the resistance. And there's, in the introduction to the book, there's a haunting phrase. And he says, Thompson says, I'm writing this book partly because I hope that struggles that were lost here might be won elsewhere. And it was when I was able to live in the Pacific, the tropical Pacific, and to live in a Pacific society and participate in it, and then to travel to other parts of the Pacific, these so-called peripheral areas of capitalism, that I became aware that the story of imperialism in the South isn't just a story of relentless depredation and destruction. It's also a story of a system that has repeatedly been checked and challenged by indigenous ways of life and culture. And that began in the 19th century with what I call Pacific counter-modernities. The Kingdom of Hawaii, which despite its name was a secular and very progressive democracy. The Waikato Kingdom here, Parihaka, the Kingdom of Tonga. A number of these societies where Pacific peoples are looking at their own past, which in some cases was quite an egalitarian past, and were constructing alternatives, assimilating but also transforming Western ideas. And colonisation gets in the way, but in the post-colonial era, we see the reconstruction and the revival of some of these practices. I was recently in Vanuatu. Vanuatu is on the front line of the encroachments of imperialism. Chinese capital is trying to take over the retail sector and a lot of the capitalist sector there. And in Vanuatu, I was able to see attempts to adapt traditional ways of life to counter that. Cooperatives, land associations, communes. And so for me, the story of anti-imperialism is also a Pacific story. And there are resources and traditions we can build on right here in the Pacific. So that's my perspective.
Thank you. Cool. Next up, we have Patrick Tan.
Hey everyone, I'm just some guy. Yeah. So I prepared. I didn't trust myself to be off the cuff about things, so I'm just gonna read out what I wrote, which is kind of in three parts. One is, I think people here have offered sophisticated definitions of imperialism. I'm going to talk about how I generally talk to more uninitiated people about imperialism, through how imperialism manifests as global inequalities experienced in our everyday lives. And then I'm going to talk about why it's particularly important for us in the global north to look at imperialism. And then a bit about the difference between Marxist critiques of imperialism and liberal and right-wing critiques. So first, a disclaimer on terms. I'm going to be using global north and global south to talk about global inequalities that result from imperialism. but I don't mind people using core, periphery, or even developed and underdeveloped nations. I think they all each have their problems and their own terms that require elaboration. I think talking about overexploited rather than underdeveloped in the way that someone like Marco Parenti talks about it makes a lot of sense. And so does Walter Rodney, using underdeveloped as a verb or an act that Europe did to Africa. But I just haven't used them because it feels a bit clunky to use. Anyway, what is imperialism? I generally talk about imperialism to people as how global inequalities and inequalities between the global north and the global south specifically connects to our everyday life experiences. So, for example, imperialism is when each of us owns a phone made from cobalt mined in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where the mining company has expanded by evicting local inhabitants, and corporations that benefit from the extracted resources pay the local government to police and suppress resistance at the mine. It's also when the bananas we buy from the supermarket here are grown in the Philippines, harvested by peasants and workers on lands that were stolen from them by their state in agreement with multinational agribusiness corporations like Dole, and where the profits that come from these bananas, instead of going towards the development of the local economy for the benefit of those same peasants and workers, so that they get wages enough to live, healthcare services, education, industry development for full employment, tools and technology for less backbreaking work, their land giving back to them, etc. The vast majority of the profits go toward the capitalist class of the global north, with some portion of it going to states of the global north in a way that many working class people of the global north also benefit from. This is slightly counter to what John said earlier, and I think I will respond to that in more detail a bit later. But maybe benefit is not how I would frame that. But I'll go on for now. Imperialism is also the consequences of ecological devastation caused by capitalism being borne by countries that contribute at least to it. It's 80% of Nauru being left uninhabitable because of phosphate mining by New Zealand to prop up our dairy industry we now rely on so much. It's once in 100-year super typhoons hitting the Philippines every couple of years, and once in 100-year floods hitting Bangladesh every couple of years. It's Pacific Islands being most at risk of sea level rise when their greenhouse gas emissions don't even register on charts. It's the solution to climate change being to extract more and more renewable energy minerals from Latin America, Africa, and the Pacific Islands, and to enforce this extraction and repress resistance to this extraction with violence. Imperialism is also the fact that these dire consequences become reasons for the people of the global south to be more and more dependent on global supply chains controlled by capital from the global north. Like when most of the land of Nauru became infertile because of phosphate extraction, and so the population has to rely on imported canned goods, since it became impossible for them to grow their own food. And Nauru now having the lowest life expectancy in the Pacific and the highest obesity rate in the world because of this reliance. Imperialism is also migrants from India, the Philippines, and from Samoa, Tonga, Niue, and other Pacific islands being forced to move here because their homes were made uninhabitable by New Zealand and its allies, and by local governments supported by the interests of capital from the global north. Forced migration. Imperialism is also it being so normal for ordinary people living in the global north to rely on the global dynamic that we don't even think about it. When someone asks us where that banana comes from, our instinct is to say the supermarket. And where our phone comes from, Apple, rather than the people who made them. And yeah, so why is it, so that's what is imperialism. And so why is it important to look at imperialism when we're in the global north, when we're more often benefactors of imperialist plunder than anything else? I'll start it like this. So I was a sociology major for my undergrad, And capitalism often gets gestured to in sociology classrooms, but with some exceptions, I've found imperialism rarely gets talked about as a part of any critique of capitalism, especially when it comes to cultural studies, which I think some people in the audience might resonate with. Yeah, I'd be interested in what everyone else's experience on this has been on this as well. If you share it or if you experienced it differently, etc. Maybe it's changed throughout the years. Yeah, and on this front, I don't think it's a mismatch of cultural studies with a Marxist critique of imperialism at all, because a huge part of culture now is how our culture produces and enforces an ideology that justifies the global inequality necessary for capitalism to survive. This is probably a symptom of New Zealand being much more closely aligned with the global North imperialist nations than the global South. So we benefit from exploitation of the global South, with our industries being supported by colonial plunder, external as well as internal to our borders, our workforce being bolstered by diaspora that are here because of forced migration, and our economy being propped up by availability of cheap commodities from overseas. I'll shout out two of my lecturers as exceptions to this. Carly Birch, who focuses on nuclear issues and the climate's connection to capitalism. Her Sociology 300 paper, which is called Feminist Anti-Colonial Post-Capitalist Techno-Futures. Yeah, she's a science and technology studies enjoyer. Can you guys tell? It helped me. It helped direct me toward thinking about capitalism, how capitalism functions globally a lot more. And Amy Rakete, you guys know Amy. Yeah. So anyway, what does imperialism do for us in the global North? I would say it moves the economic exploitation and other consequences of capitalism, like environmental devastation, to places where it's harder for us to see. I like thinking about this as a spatial fix. I think David Harvey uses this, where the problem internal to a system is disappeared by moving it outside, or rather incorporating more inside itself, rather than uprooting its causes. This is stuff we already talked about, like lithium mining in Chile and our indigenous land in Western Australia, in order to adapt our energy systems to renewables in an attempt to forestall climate change, rather than accepting that the endless need for growth under capitalism is fundamentally at odds with ecological limits. In this way, I think of imperialism as a survival strategy for capitalism. It's what capitalism must do in order to continue living. Without a perspective on imperialism, it's easy for workers and socialists of the global North to become enemies of those in the global South. And that's exactly the type of divide and conquer that benefits imperialism. So the implication for organizing is for us to organize along anti-capitalist as well as anti-imperialist lines. And this is something that John has pointed to as well. For example, support global anti-imperialist struggles and organize socialist movements here that are themselves anti-imperialist, especially here in the global North, where it's a lot safer for us to organize. There are organizations that exist to help achieve this. For example, some of us from Working Students of Aotearoa, WSA, went to the inaugural conference of ILPS Aotearoa, which is the national chapter of the International League of People's Struggles. It's an alliance of different organizations from all over the world that have an anti-imperialist outlook. They do conferences and stuff and coordinate global anti-imperialist action. It's pretty cool. Yeah, this last section is, talking about Marxist versus liberal / right-wing critiques. When we talk about imperialism, people often think about war or armed invasions. But when we take a Marxist perspective on imperialism, we recognize that these are just one part of imperialism. What we're looking at when we focus purely on militarization and war is we're really looking at one of the tactics of imperialism. In other words, it is one way through which this global inequality that serves the interests of the capitalist class of a handful of nations is enforced. There are many ways this is enforced. There are many other ways this is enforced. Debt burdens, unequal trade agreements, international political and financial institutions, the CIA, control of key industries by multinationals, the CIA, local politicians that are in the pockets of multinational corporations or global north geopolitical interests, various ideological methods, the CIA, etc. All of these are ways local economic conditions favorable to global north capitalists and imperialists are enforced. Military might is just a particularly important factor to consider because it underpins most of these others. I.e., if the US didn't have 45 military bases in Guam, it'd be a lot easier for the Pacific Island nations to go against US interests. If China or the DPRK gave up their nuclear weapons, they might end up with the same fate as Libya. If we limit imperialism to war making, it becomes easy to associate the causes of imperialism to individuals, violent dictators, cabals of conspirators. That's how we get to liberal solutions like, oh, if we just make sure we vote really hard and funny orange man doesn't get to control everything, we'll be all right. Or right-wing solutions like race war. There's a lot of divide and conquer in these other critiques. And none of these are very good ways of stopping imperialism because that's not why imperialism happens. What imperialists do aren't evil schemes made from thin air. They are simply what makes sense for them to do based on their objective economic interests in a global system constructed by and for their interests. And that's the other difference with the Marxist perspective. Marxists look at which classes have an objective economic interest aligned with imperialism, whose interest does this global inequality serve, and which classes have objective economic interests aligned against imperialism at each historical conjuncture, and therefore who we can ally with at each historical conjuncture. It's important to look upstream at the driving forces of why these global inequalities have to exist in order for capitalism to survive. We have to look at all the tactics of how these global inequalities are enforced through this lens, and that's what the Marxist perspective provides. So 30 seconds, why now? First I have a question. Is it actually being talked about more recently, like imperialism? I guess I started thinking about imperialism only very recently, so maybe I'm part of the proof, but would be interested to hear what everyone else thinks. A couple of things. Why now? I guess Israel and Palestine, and the blatant role of basically the entire Western world in that. Ukraine and the notion of inter-imperialist conflict coming to the fore, whether we think it's accurate or not. Militarization in the Pacific, which is prompting us in Aotearoa to look at the New Zealand role in upholding U.S. imperialist interests as well. And also, I'm interested in this. What's happening in the Sahel region in Africa? Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, and more West African nations. Anti-imperialists kicking the French out. Yep, that's
cool. No, well, so hopefully some. That's interesting. Hopefully, a lot of the why now will also become through in the Q&A and a lot of the timely stuff there. So, just to recap, we had some really insightful stuff coming through with John sort of engaging with imperialism as sort of an outflow from the state, and Scott coming through with this kind of this sort of extended view as an expansion of the crisis of capitalism and this sort of disinherited, which was then carried further by Patrick in terms of the spatial fix as an idea. So just for format, we'll pass the mic, as it were, back to John, and you have a chance now to respond to your other panelists.
Yep. Kia ora koutou. Look, I'll just say a few things. I enjoyed the presentations here very much. So we're very, very different in a way. My perspective and what I talked about is very much flavoured by the last 2 years with what Israel is doing to Palestine, and it's so I think, that's that perspective which I brought to the discussion tonight. I'll just a few quick points. The CIA as Patrick's Minto. I had a note here to talk about the CIA. The answer to the antidote to imperialism is international solidarity. Well, the CIA's chief role, its central function, is to destroy solidarity. Its central function, destroy solidarity, to destroy any democratic forces that are working against the US interess. And that's basically the rest of the world. So just a slightly random point, but I didn't realise till very late in my life, really, just how much capitalists hate the United Nations, and they hate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Right? So if you understand how much they hate it, then you understand how important the concepts are in that. Because the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, really important concepts that can be used as a kind of a backbone for international law and for, our government talks about international rules-based order. They've talked about it for years. What they really mean is a US-based order. We need to have, support much more the, a universal view of that rather than a US view. So I think the US support for Israel is based on, it is in the US imperial interest to support Israel. And it's as simple as that. And I'll take my hat off here. Mike Trent's not here, but he in a discussion about 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago with him on this. And I was saying, well, the strength of the pro-Israel lobby in the US and blah, blah. And he said, as Mike does, people who know Mike, sits back and says, no. He said, it is America supports Israel because it is in America's interest to have Israel there. Israel is there to keep the Arab world in line. Israel is there to smash any Arab nationalism. It is to smash any Arab country that wants to gain control of its own resources. Israel is there to smash it, like Israel did in 1953 when the Mossadegh government, democratically elected government in Iran, destroyed by the CIA because they wanted to gain control of their own oil resources and they wanted to develop their country in the interests of the people there. So he said to me, and that as soon as it is no longer in the US interests to support Israel, it will drop Israel like a hot cake, just like it dropped white South Africa back in the late 1980s, because it just became too much trouble for them to defend. They were using too much political capital up on white South Africa, so they abandoned it and they essentially forced de Klerk to negotiate, and that's where we found the end of apartheid. So what will happen in the US when it is no longer in the US's interests? As I said, they'll drop Israel like a hot cake, and then we'll see a massive round of anti-Semitism in the US itself. You'll get Republican senators getting up in the Senate and saying, look at this appalling situation we're in. The Jews have cost us trillions of dollars in wars in the Middle East. And what has it got us? It's got us nothing but this massive debt. The Jews are the problem. And we'll have anti-Semitism just writ large across the US. And the pro-Israel lobby in the US will simply be brushed aside. So, okay. So you might like to think, the US is, because of the Holocaust, no, there's nothing to do with that. It's just blind economic interests. And I was going to say the US doesn't have to bully New Zealand. New Zealand does exactly what the US wants anyway. and thinking about this, how terribly bloody disappointing it's been for those of us who fought really hard in the 1980s to develop an independent foreign policy. And we moved away. We didn't move fully away. We moved away from the US. We moved out of their close orbit. We were still there orbiting, but we moved out. We said we're not going to have nuclear ships here, nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed ships. A really positive step forward. And then we have the invasion of Ukraine. Jacinda Ardern gets invited to a NATO meeting, and suddenly, over a period of 3 years, New Zealand's come right back in close to the orbit of the US. And Winston Peters loves it. He's always loved the US. He loves Western imperialism. Just loves it. It's in his name. He loves it. So I think that's something that we're, of course, Palestinians, the solidarity movement here is fighting against at the moment, and we have to break that close connection between New Zealand and the US and Israel. I mean, it's just such an utterly shameful thing to say, that you live in a country where the government refuses to speak out against what 95% of humanity can see as a genocide in Gaza. Does our government speak out against it? No. Winston Peters gets up. Sorry, I'm starting to rave here, but I'll just
1 minute.
Gets up at the United Nations and says, it's appalling what's happening in Gaza. It's a catastrophe. It's awful. It's appalling. Did he ever say who was to blame for it? Never, ever has he uttered a single word of criticism of the US or Israel, but he has condemned every single act of Palestinian resistance. He has condemned every single Palestinian resistance organisation. That's my rave.
Thank you.
Yes, thank
you. You happy to take it then from there, Scott, in terms of responses?
Yeah. No, I think picking up on what John says, I did a piece for the spin-off late in 2023 about, and I think this is something that New Zealanders, quite a common response to the terrible situation in Gaza. New Zealanders say, it's nothing to do with us. We've got no connection. And historically, that's not true. We played an absolutely crucial role in creating this terrible situation. And so it was really interesting for me to go and do some research on this subject. Now, New Zealand, and this comes back to the ideology of imperialism. I don't know if many people have heard of British Israelism. British Israelism is very, very strange doctrine. In the 19th century, a lot of people, white people in the British Empire, began to believe they were a lost tribe of Israel. They were the true Jews. And this became a widespread belief. Yep. And the British Empire was God's kingdom on earth. And our Prime Minister during World War I, William Massey, was a British Israelite as well as a member of the Orange Order. Those two groups overlapped a lot. I suspect some of my ancestors are belonging to both. And when we went into Sinai, Palestine, Syria during World War I, opening up another front in the war along with the Australians, to try to help the beleaguered armies on the Western Front in Europe. This is how a lot of New Zealanders interpreted things like the capture of Jerusalem. There were New Zealand commanders who stopped when they crossed the border of Palestine and gave thanks to God for giving the Holy Land back to God's people. And Jerusalem was seen as, the capture of Jerusalem was seen as a gift of God to the British people. Defenders of Israel today in New Zealand they've tried to rewrite that military campaign in terms of New Zealand saving Jews, but actually there was a significant degree of anti-Semitism amongst our troops because they felt that the Jews living in Palestine were the fake Jews. We were the real Jews. And when you look at the most notorious event during our occupation of Palestine, which is the massacre at Surafend, when dozens of Palestinian civilians were killed in a revenge attack by New Zealand troops, killed in cold blood and had their genitals cut off and thrown down wells. Surafend, is remembered to its credit by Auckland Museum. There's a permanent display about this terrible event. You can also find it in important military books like Terry Kinloch's book about our campaign in Palestine. But it's often seen as an isolated event. It's very much part of a pattern, and is connected, I found in my research, to the very origins of the IDF, because there was a Jewish legion of volunteers, Jewish volunteers from America, that was fighting alongside the Anzacs. They also had a group of West Indian soldiers fighting with them who got called the Black Anzacs. It's kind of cool. Yeah. And the Jewish legion, I read a couple of memoirs of the Jewish soldiers, so British, American volunteers, and sadly, they were directly inspired by Surafend, and they went out and carried on their own attacks afterwards in imitation of Surafend. This is a period where the situation in Palestine is deteriorating despite the end of the war. The British are giving conflicting promises to both communities. There is tit-for-tat violence all the time. But Surafend inspires the Jewish Legion, and the Jewish Legion is often seen today as the seed of the IDF. And so right at this very early stage in the development of the IDF, you have Anzac troops, or New Zealand troops, inspiring some fairly extreme Zionist volunteer soldiers to carry out their own atrocities. So we are, I'm afraid, in there at the beginning, both in terms of our that ideological inspiration and in our role in actually conquering Palestine and setting up the situation. So it is not something we're distanced from. Another something, I mean, you might have a thought on this, John, but something I haven't quite understood is the lack of discussion in New Zealand about our long-time presence on the border of Gaza as part of the multinational force and observers, which was, as I understand it, an international force founded after the Camp David peace accords. Now, we've been there for decades in various capacities, liaising with Egyptian military and Israeli military. Now, perhaps in the 1980s there might have been a way to justify this as part of a peace accord, but the regimes in both Egypt and Israel are deeply repugnant. And in Sinai, Egypt has been fighting its own war against the Bedouin people there, a war which has claimed thousands of lives. So the continuing involvement of New Zealand armed forces in helping to seal off Gaza and in making life easier for the IDF and for the Egyptians. You know, it seems to me that is a direct contribution that New Zealand makes that could be discussed a great deal more.
So, thank you very much. Cool. And Patrick, if you'd like to take a chance to respond to the other two panelists.
Yeah, a couple of really interesting things. First, I guess I'll get to the what John said about how imperialism, the benefactors of imperialism is the capitalist businesses in the global north. I think mostly that's probably correct. And maybe I wouldn't say it benefits the people in the global north, but more makes the global north less crisis-ridden.
Yeah.
Such that there's less of a revolutionary force here.
Yes.
Because of imperialist super profits, the states in the global north are able to give more concessions to the workers of the global north. Maybe you could frame that more as a bribe instead of a benefit. So that the risk is the left wing in the imperial core becomes fighting for a piece of the imperialist pie rather than overthrow of the entire system. Yeah, that's that part. And I also found it really interesting what Scott said about settlers in Australia and here migrating initially because of imperialism, because of the impacts of imperialism. And that's kind of part of the geographical fix, right, of imperialism as a way of offloading the surplus population created by permanent accumulation back in Britain, and making them become shock troops of imperialism. And I thought that was a great juxtaposition as well between the settlers as first victims and then the shock troops of imperialism.
Yeah.
That also makes me think of the messaging WSA, working students, had when we tried to kick the NZDF off our campus to stop them from recruiting here. I'll just read a piece of what we had in there. Students have limited employment prospects. Students are being actively thrust into debt. The military presents itself as a way out. It makes us choose between so-called peace and security and perpetual debt, and that this is a predatory recruitment mechanism. The New Zealand Defence Force capitalizes on students' precarious employment prospects to recruit them as tools of the US empire. And it speaks to how imperialism is a way to divide and conquer as a survival strategy for capitalism. It's really interesting how capitalism has a way of coming up with these sneaky ways of turning its enemies into its friends. I think we have to be smarter than that, and we have to expose these tactics as what they are. And I think we are smarter. Yeah, that's from the remarks at the beginning. But from the responses as well. What John said about Mike's comment on the Israel lobby. I think that's a really good point to emphasize. That's a good example, I think, of the difference between Marxist and liberal critiques of imperialism specifically, where it emphasizes like corporate influence rather than class conflict, and talking about how the US is supporting Israel not because of the Israel lobby, as if the lobby didn't exist, it wouldn't support it. The Holocaust, etc., and other arguments the US uses are just ideological facades. They're not actually why they do what they do. They're post hoc justifications. Yeah.
Window dressing.
Yeah. And really illuminating piece of history about British Israelism and the role of Anzac troops in Palestine. Yeah. Oh, there's another thing. When John was talking about how there's the role of the CIA, it made me think of this quote. I love this. It's from Killing Hope by William Bloom, which this book is on the on Osama bin Laden's bunker, and it's posted on the CIA website, and it's talking about how. So William Bloom was employed in the U.S. State Department during the Vietnam War, and then he got disillusioned by the war and started writing books against U.S. imperialism. I don't think he's a socialist or anything, but I'll read this quote out. Will this mean any better life for the multitudes than the Cold War brought? Any more regard for the common folk than there's been since they fell off the cosmic agenda centuries ago? By all means, says Capital, offering another warmed-up version of the trickle-down theory, the principle that the poor who must... Oh, wait, I'll skip this part, actually. Start here. The boys of Capital, they also chortle in their martinis about the death of socialism. The word has been banned from polite conversation, and they hope that no one will notice that every socialist experiment of any significance in the 20th century, without exception, has either been crushed, overthrown, or invaded, or corrupted, perverted, subverted, or destabilized, or otherwise had life made impossible for it by the United States. Not one socialist government or movement, from the Russian Revolution to the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, from Communist China to the FMLN in Salvador, not one was permitted to rise or fall solely on its own merits. Not one was left secure enough to drop its guard against the all-powerful enemy abroad and freely and fully relax control at home. It's as if the Wright brothers' first experiments with flying machines all failed because the automobile interests sabotaged each test flight. And then the good and God-fearing folk of the world looked upon this, took notice of the consequences, nodded their collective heads wisely, and intoned solemnly, "Man shall never fly." Yeah, that's my response.
Oh, nice point to end it. Cool. So, unless there's anything else that was sparked through with the responses, which looks like everyone's sedate, we'll move through to the Q&A section. So just a bit of housekeeping. If we can try and sort of keep the questions short, that means we can answer more of them. And if you have something longer that you'd like to say of sort of more content, I can take this chance to remind you that the Platypus review is open to all written supplements. So with that being said, is there anyone who'd like to open with a question? Sure.
Yeah, I'd like to explore what John raised about the USA being a declining imperial power, which raises the question of which is the increasing one, and I don't think it's Russia, although Daniel Ellsberg, if you're my age to remember who leaked the Pentagon Papers, he spoke later on as Russia being the essential enemy of the USA because it was technological and it provided a threat that they could sell their high-end armaments. But the rising power is China, and increasingly we've been talked into building military connections with the USA to prepare for war with China, which I think is a very scary prospect, and particularly if you read Eldred Grieg's book about the beginnings of World War I and the way the USA boxed Japan into a corner to try and get them to go to war before they got strong enough to fight back.
Okay, so the question is on the implications of a competing imperialism? Or
the rising imperialism, yes.
Okay, cool. Seeing as you were addressed directly in it, would you like to take it first and then we can put the other panelists?
I lost the words. So one of you take it up first. I'll have another go.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really profound analogy to World War II and the situation with Japan and the rising power in the Pacific. And I think we have to differentiate between Chinese economic and military power. China doesn't have the capacity to project military power a long way from its borders. It doesn't have the kind of pointillist empire of military bases scattered around the world that America has. It doesn't have a history of projecting military power far from its borders. So those are important things. But as an economic threat, in my view, and in my experience, China is a very profound economic threat to the small nations of the Pacific and is the rising imperial power in that region. Last year I was in Tonga. I went into a village store and I was going to buy some milk, and there were a whole lot of bloody teeth lying on the store counter, gold teeth that had been pulled out of people's mouths. The local people in the village had incurred a debt to the store owners. There's a pattern by which typically Chinese importers import in bulk and get economies of scale, and then they become money lenders and then take over the rest of the economy. And it was a very vivid sign to me of economic imbalance and of a very worrying trend. There's a cultural gap which is left open. When globalisation came to Tonga in the 90s and they went into the WTO, a lot of Tongans got involved importing cheap goods, setting up corner stores, and there were these little dairies on all the corners in Nuku'alofa. But then the genius of Tongan collectivist culture kind of took over and stymied that attempt at capitalism, because all the cousins came in, a freebie and a loan, and you cannot violate your obligations to your family, to your kainga. And so people found it impossible to accumulate capital. And this story is across the Pacific. We see this story. Entrepreneurism is sunk by traditional Pacific cultural practices and kin obligations. And that meant all of those stores went out of business very quickly. And the sociologist Nico Besnier studied this in detail. They all went out of business. Chinese store operators are often people who are in a very difficult situation back home. There are similarities with the story of my ancestors. They are often fleeing difficult situations, often they're in debt, and they are working for capitalists who don't show their faces. And they come in and they don't have those kin obligations. And so they are able to accumulate capital quite quickly. And so I think within these small economies, it is a major economic threat, and it's a heavy-handed policy of economic colonisation, and it's counterproductive as well because it's bred a very intense antipathy to China, and it's unnecessary. I think that China should take that approach. I think they could have taken a much more collaborative approach to economic development. So I think making it clear to New Zealanders that China is not a military threat, and we shouldn't be dragooned into a military alliance against them. But by the same token, being aware of some of the economic challenges that some of our Pacific neighbours are facing from Chinese capital. I think we need to do both.
Cool, thank you. John?
I'll chip in and say that before October the 7th, that is before the Hamas attack in Israel on October the 7th, US foreign policy was shifting away from the Middle East. And the whole focus was shifting to the South Pacific and China, and under Biden, and for quite a while before then, the US just wanted Israel just to shrink the war, minimise it. If they were going to steal land, just Palestinian land, just steal it a little bit at a time. Don't have a big kerfuffle. And 7 or 8 years ago, John Pilger wrote the book. He wrote an article called "The Coming War on China," or he did a documentary on it, "The Coming War on China." So he was foresighted enough to see what was going to happen. And then October the 7th, the US had to maintain its focus in the Middle East, and it has slowed down. It still wants to shift the whole focus onto China. And for the life of me, you've got the Australian Labor government signs up for hundreds of billions of dollars spending for nuclear submarines, nuclear-powered submarines for the South Pacific. It is absolutely brainless, stupid at every level, and some people have said it's so mad it can't ever happen. Well, stranger things have to happen. So we're in an incredibly serious situation here, with the whole focus coming on and the pressure on the government. And Winston Peters doesn't need any pressure to do what he's told. I mean, he goes to the White House, and they say to him, and media say, what are you going to do when you go to the White House? And he says, well, I'm going to listen. I'm going to listen to what America expects New Zealand to do. Is this independent foreign policy? Is this someone standing up for New Zealand first? No way, it's standing up for US first. It's the most craven, awful, appalling behaviour. But we're being sucked into that, And as Scott said, the US, I mean, if you look at the world map, I think China has one military base outside of its own borders, and that's in the Middle East somewhere. I can't remember now. But America, frickin' hell, the dots are everywhere. You can't fit the countries in; they're covered in dots. American military bases all over the world. And again, you've got this economy that's based on production, the military-industrial complex, which Eisenhower had talked about. the real danger that it would take on a life of its own, and it certainly has. So yeah, we are in for an incredibly difficult time, and the peace movement here, civil society groups here, we have to mobilise in New Zealand to fight that, absolutely fight it, so that New Zealand doesn't join AUKUS, that we don't have. We don't join AUKUS, and ideally we've got to get out of Five Eyes. We've got to get out of Five Eyes. It is absolutely anathema to the people of New Zealand, but of course it's not anathema to the US or the elites that run New Zealand. In the headquarters of the Ministry of Defence, GCSB, SIS, these are the people, the deep state people in New Zealand, whose first loyalty is to the US rather than to New Zealand. And I'll take that a little bit further. The Five Eyes Alliance, I didn't understand this till a few years ago. The Five Eyes Alliance, it's an alliance of spy organisations. It's not an alliance of the governments. So the GCSB deals with America directly. Doesn't do it through the New Zealand government. Yes, there's some sort of, they all pretend, it's, the governments do. It's actually the spy organisations themselves that are. So we've got our most conservative right-wing people in New Zealand with these intense links to these their Five Eyes partners in these other countries.
Cool. Thanks, John. I can see Patrick typing up, so it sounds like you look like you've got a response that's been going through.
Oh,
Would you like to take the...
Not really, actually.
Just one moment, sorry. We'll sort of manage the questions as we go through, but there'll be an opportunity to ask one shortly. Sorry, Patrick, please.
Yeah, I thought Scott's response about China is really good. Mm-hmm. Yeah. China doesn't seem to have enough to project military strength. And the US has, I think the number is like 700 something military bases worldwide. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's always interesting to talk about China in the context of imperialism. And I'm not educated enough on this to say, I don't know, whether China's doing imperialist stuff or anything. It's something I'm always open to learning more about. Yeah.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, there's a question up front, and then we'll have a chance in just one moment. Sorry.
Thanks for everyone's remarks. I found them really gratifying and interesting. I was really struck by something that Scott remarked on early on about reading the Communist Manifesto and kind of realizing that Marx, in fact, is he's not affirming capitalism, of course, but he's saying that it points beyond itself, that it is creative destruction, as you termed it. I was wondering how this might relate to imperialism in the sense that, John said that imperialism is joined at the hip with capitalism, that they're two sides of the same coin, I guess would be another way of putting it. If both hold true, what I am interested in is how imperialism can offer a way beyond capitalism. And when I say that, what I'm kind of thinking of in the back of my head is Lenin and some of the controversies that emerged out of the Second International. World War I was basically the reason that the Second International broke up. It represented the crisis of imperialism, but also the crisis of the movement. And so what I want to understand is how imperialism has changed in its meaning for the left over time, whereas once upon a time it might have been common to hear about there being imperialisms on the left, or understandings of imperialisms, I should say, that there were contentions. How much of this was overshadowed or haunted by the Soviet Union, maybe for some of the older panelists who were around during the Soviet Union, during the New Left or kind of the Gen X period, you have an experience of discussions and disagreements and controversies on the left that younger people don't have. There are people in this room who would have gone to rallies and see the Spartacus League handing out their pamphlets, or controversies between the Cliffites, kind of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, versus this kind of more orthodox sectarian style, maybe critical support of like national movements, even while opposing US hegemony. These kind of older discussions. So how is the left today understanding imperialism? Is there still such a thing as imperialisms, and what does this have to do with history?
Would anyone like to, if anyone's feeling moved, to jump forward, feel free.
I think it's a big one, but I think there's a deeper. I mean, God, what's the old joke? You put 4 Marxists in a room, you get 5 factions. I mean, the number of debates. When I was a kid in Marxist groups about whether New Zealand is an imperialist country or a semi-colonial country. Because on the one hand we're sending a lot of capital abroad, but on the other hand we play a sort of imperialist role in the Pacific. And these debates would go round and round and get quite acrimonious. And similarly with debates about the Soviet Union. Is it a deformed worker state, or is it this, or is it that? And I think there's a way of stepping back from the immediate subject and actually looking at a methodological level. And I find Bertil Ohlmann is a very good writer about dialectics and Marxist method. And I think that is one of the strong. I've been critical of some aspects of Marxist thought. His method is something I think we can learn quite a bit from. And Ullman points out that Marx, if you look at Capital, at one point in Capital, Marx talks about, or a number of points, he talks about the capitalist class. But in other points, he talks about bankers as a distinct class. He doesn't, this is one example, he doesn't seem to have these strict definitions going along. He seems to contradict himself. But Ullman points out that when we think dialectically, the world's a big place, we can't swallow it whole. We have to split it up, we have to abstract it, that's the word he uses, we abstract it. So we abstract it in one way, we use one definition. We abstract another way, we use another definition. And so it seems to me that some of these debates, it's not necessarily that one person's completely right and the other person's completely wrong. I think they're dealing with different abstractions and they're looking at things in a different way. And I think there's a lot to be said for a little bit of generosity of spirit in these debates. I think, there's a danger of assuming there's only one correct way of proceeding or one correct type of Marxism. But Marxism, Marx may not have intended it, but we've endlessly got new types of Marxism, haven't we? It can't stop sort of reproducing in different ways. So I think,
Yeah, I've always said I think it's a danger if we keep looking around for a blueprint. I don't think there is a blueprint there. We have to create our own blueprints and then recreate them and then recreate them depending on the circumstances we're in. Okay, it's nice to believe there's a blueprint that we can follow. There isn't one. We have to create it as we go along. The interesting one of the most interesting points I've sort of found recently is that Israel today is described by Palestinian activists as a colonial state, right? And there's very good reasons for that going back to, Theodore Herzl and Shane Wiseman. They openly talked about it being Britain will understand why we want this colony in the Middle East. Britain understands colonisation. We want to colonise the Middle East. But back in the 1980s, activists described it, or here, I'm not sure about Palestinian groups, but activists described it here as part of US imperialism. We saw it as an extension of US imperialism into that part of the world, to control that part of the world, as I was saying before. So, I guess both of those are true, but yeah, there's a much greater, I think, global focus on colonisation here in Aotearoa, around the colonised world, and Israel's got that. Israel is seen as sort of the last European colony being established, but it being established in the middle of the 20th century, when it was out of fashion to have a colonial state. And of course, Israel was never described as a colonial state, but the fact that the early Zionists did.
Thank you.
Yep.
Question over there.
Am I allowed to talk yet?
Yes, so you went into some, but did you have a response to this question before we roll through?
just a little bit elaboration, I guess, on what everyone else has said. About stepping back from the anti-imperialism splits debates. I think it's great points. And I think it's important to look at how supporting anti-imperialism doesn't just mean supporting the one Marxist movement that agrees with us. Like the reason we support Palestinian liberation is not because it's got the perfect blueprint for a socialist society or whatever. I guess.
Cool. Shoot. Sorry about that.
Well, I'm the only person in the world that's got 5 different coloured eyes, literally. I went to an iridologist, and it is because of my most recent past life. I was a spy. I had a really good life. I was even in the CIA, but this life I've only read about the CIA, and some of it's quite ominous. But so I literally, with a professional iridologist, I've got the only person in the world with 5 different coloured eyes. Blue, green, hazel, brown, amber, but underneath blue. But so I'm really unusual like that. And that's why I'm so interested in being informed by this organisation. I belong to quite a few, as my degrees in history and media. And I just want to say that with this, corporate colonialism, I actually think there should be some ecocide law because, Christopher Luxon is a born leader and started off so well, but then all of a sudden deeds started going to black energy, and he did have some history of doing that in Boston with what was it called? One of the ecocide companies, Unilever. And so I definitely think that society really needs to enforce this ecocide law in places.
Okay, thank you. So the question, just to make sure I'm understanding correctly, would be concerning, I guess, the environmental impact of imperialism directly as a ongoing crisis. Is there anything that anyone would like to speak to on that point?
I'd just say that I think, as far as the environment's concerned, you've got capitalism and you've got the environment, and they're at war with each other, and only one can win, and it has to be the environment. I think, what capitalism does, what do you internalise the profits and externalise the costs or whatever, and you put those costs onto the environment and onto people and onto whatever. So I think that's,
I think, Vanuatu has just been doing one of the prices of New Zealand's alliance with America is that we hold back often from taking strong stances on environmental issues, on things like global warming. Vanuatu's kind of stepped into the breach, and Ralph Reagan-Vanu, who's not only a politician but a really brilliant thinker and intellectual over there, has been taking a case in the International Court of Justice, getting considerable amount of publicity over climate change, and when I read about his statements in court and look at what he's doing, I feel a sense of shame, really, because where's my country? Much bigger than Vanuatu, much wealthier, but it is a small Pacific country which is in the vanguard of raising these issues and of pushing for climate justice.
I think, in terms of ecocide and legalistic ways to there are helpful legalistic ways that the environment is being fought over. I think I can't remember the lawyer's name. Ecuador, the Amazon oil spills, and he was in jail for hundreds of days. Anyway, I think there's people doing good work on that side of things, and I also think that there's good on the ground movements that we should look to that are anti-extractivist, working towards anti-imperialist goals, and maybe that's the primary space we should look to, rather than pushing for focusing all our energy on like pushing for ecocide as a instrument.
Organising, yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. That makes sense.
Up the back.
Yeah, I have a question regarding sort of like both physical geography and also virtual spaces as well. The late American anthropologist James C. Scott wrote about in his book The Art of Not Being Governed, an anarchist history of upland Southeast Asia, about the shadow zone, what he terms the shadow zone region of Zomia, which is the upland foreland regions of Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, South China and Burma, and how that place was the rugged topography and dense vegetation made it very impenetrable for many centuries for various kingdoms and empire and later European colonial empires to penetrate that and influence that area imperialistically. I'm wondering whether whether the shadow zone is sort of a valid concept in this day and age for anti-imperialist practice, and whether that might take a more virtual form in terms of like crypto, like blockchain currencies or online virtual private networks, and maybe how that might play out over time.
Thank you. Would anyone like to?
In terms of decentralisation and local autonomy, I think a lot of New Zealanders possibly underestimate how much it is a reality in a number of Pacific societies. For instance, in Vanuatu last year, I was able to visit a number of village courts. They have a completely parallel village system with courts which answer to no one outside the village, even trying, in some cases, serious cases like murder. And you not only have that, but you, in some villages, you have a separate legal code. I visited one village where there was a constitution for the village and there were 200 clauses. Now, this can lead to complications and there's all sorts of things going on because it's still a traditional village system. But and so I don't want to romanticize it, but it is a reality. And I was talking to someone yesterday who is Manayan and went back to the island in the Southern Cooks because their title to land had lapsed there and they had to meet the land council. Manaia has never been surveyed, and there's a land council that meets on the island that apportions land that, when somebody, so this person wanted to request some land for their retirement. And so there's no way of defining that. You basically say, you can have this land from the boulder to the tree. It's all in those terms, and there's an extraordinary level of decentralisation, and it sits alongside access to sophisticated government services like a hospital, a small hospital on the island, and a school. And it's actually a fantastic example of decentralisation in Tino Rangatiratanga. So I definitely think like these things are very pertinent.
That's okay.
I have a question from the Zoom when there are no questions in the room.
Now's a good time.
No, you go.
I was just wondering, thank you, gentlemen, it's been excellent. Is there anything you can tell us about the lobby groups? I'm particularly interested in the pro-Israel lobby groups. For example, could you tell me where their nuts are?
Well, three groups in New Zealand, four, I suppose. Three. The New Zealand Jewish Council represents sort of older Jewish community, members of the community, and probably still has majority support, but it's fiercely Zionist, and they use false smears of anti-Semitism against anyone. I mean, I say to any activist that if you're pro-Palestine, working for Palestine, and you're not receiving false smears of anti-Semitism, then you're probably not doing a very good job. The other ones are the Israel Institute, which is a very small organisation, but it packs quite a punch on Twitter. And that's David Kuhlman at this very university here, a lecturer at the medical school. He's a very nasty racist, very nasty anti-Palestinian racist. He thinks that there'll only be peace in the Middle East when Arabs love their children more than they hate Jews. Really nasty, vile stuff. And there's 2 or 3 people with him, Perry Trotter and Shuri Trotter. And I mention their names only to emphasise how tiny the organisation is. Very, very small. And then there's the Zionist Federation, which is even smaller. That's Rob Berg. They're nothing like they are in Australia. They're much bigger and have much more clout in Australia than they have here. But they still have a lot of clout here. But there again, and in the US, of course, they're even stronger. You've got, but things are changing. Like within the Jewish community in the US, a couple of years ago, 25% of Jewish Americans said Israel is an apartheid state. They agreed with that. But among young Jews, it was 38%. So there's a generational shift. Young Jewish people are not accepting. In general, are not accepting what their parents did. They do not identify with Israel as a project they want to be part of, which is it's certainly a good thing. Yeah. And there's a lot of very lot of anti-Zionist Jews as individuals and as organisations. Really, really good in New Zealand here and around the world.
Sorry, who was the first group you discussed?
The Jewish Council. Yeah, New Zealand Jewish Council. That would be the most. That's Juliet Moses.
If I could tag on to that question, there was some discussion previously about the necessity of positioning being sort of beyond a personal politic. I believe that was that. Sorry, was that you, Scott? When you were discussing previously, or was that you? Sorry, Patrick. You were discussing the necessity of the lobbyists coming from broad material conditions rather than, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe you might want to expand on that at this juncture, because I kind of touched on it briefly.
I don't know. I don't have much to add to that. I guess it's important to look at these organizations and how much power they have, but also important to remember why the states do what they do. Like New Zealand supports Israel, not because of any lobby presence, but it certainly makes it more powerful. The support has more public support if it has a strong lobby behind it. Yeah. Oh, I guess maybe when we one thing to note is when we speak against these lobbies, it's important to attach onto it that this is supporting the interests of U.S. imperialism. Yeah, I guess that's a point to emphasize.
Yeah, I think it's really, I've engaged with these people in terms of their views on history, and Shuri Trotter, whom John mentioned, has written about history, New Zealand history in regard to Palestine, and very misleadingly. And the tragedy of these people is that they actually end up downplaying anti-Semitism. So Shuri Trotter is admiring pieces about New Zealand's military mission to Palestine in World War I. But the reality is, and anyone can read Kura Kui, which is the journal that troops published, rank and file troops, and you can see anti-Semitic language in there. You can see anti-Semitic jokes. And World War II, New Zealand, very anti-Semitic country. Very hostile to Jewish refugees from Hitler. And then in the 40s, we treat Jewish refugees as aliens. In 1945, the RSA held a national conference, and they called for the deportation of Jewish refugees from New Zealand and the confiscation of their property. Now, all of this gets washed away in the rush by people like Shuri Trotter to kind of weld Zionism to Anzac history, to sort of jump on that train. And it's actually inadvertently encouraging the forgetting of anti-Semitism.
Exactly. I think that's a really important point. The Jewish Council did a survey of anti-Semitism in New Zealand a couple of years ago, and anybody who supports BDS that is a marker, what they call a marker of anti-Semitism. If you basically support any pressure on Israel, it's a marker of anti-Semitism. So they're used to doing this, and they do it because it works. And as as Scott says, what this is doing, it's avoiding not talking about the real anti-Semitism, which is out there. There is real anti-Semitism, which Scott's alluded to, but within New Zealand society, within the white supremacist movement, all over, there's a lot of anti-Semitism. That's what we should be dealing with. I mean, there was one of those farming groups. What's it called? They've got Federated Farmers, and then you've got a couple of groups to the right of them, and they were spreading some appalling anti-Semitism in public meetings around the country. We picked it up, and we challenged the Human Rights Commission over it. We said, you've got to look at this, because this, we had all the details of it. The Jewish Council wouldn't touch it. They wouldn't touch it. They didn't want to challenge farmers. They didn't want to challenge anti-Semitism in New Zealand, because their whole focus is on supporting Israel. Whatever Israel does, we're going to support them. They didn't want to get into this discussion about real anti-Semitism in New Zealand.
So I think we've got a couple more.
Just a follow-up.
Yeah, is this one, please?
I just John, just to follow up to your points before about if Israel's no longer sorry, I'll start again. If Israel is no longer in the interests of the US, that the US will drop it like a potato. I guess one counterexample I was thinking about that is actually in terms of, I've been reading John Mearsheimer's book on the Israeli lobby from 2006. Now, I just want to say that John Mearsheimer's got some problems. He's a conservative and a Zionist more than people think. But he had some very interesting examples, even going back to 2006, where the interests of America and the interests of Israel were going like that, were separating, but still the Israeli lobby were winning, which I thought was quite an interesting thing to look at, particularly in terms of imperialism, to sort of say, well, why is that still happening? And I guess one thing that he was looking at is in terms of the Christian Zionist movement behind this idea that the Jews will go back to Israel, and then all of a sudden there'll be the apocalypse, and this is not really a good thing for the Jews either. It's what the Christian Zionists push. So I guess that's sort of my question, is sort of, it's like even going back to 2006, there was points where Israel and the US were separating in terms of their interests. So I guess, how could we take it as a movement, use that, particularly when you've got things like the war bombing Iran could come up, which might be in the interest of Israel, but might not be in the interest of American corporations who want peace.
Yep, that's true, but I think I describe those as tensions, tensions. In fact, under George Bush, there was a lot of tension between what the Bush administration thought was the right thing to do and what Israel wanted. But I think I'd say they're closer now than they've ever been. And I think back in, when Obama was there, Obama was leaving the White House, and Obama hated Netanyahu. So there was a real personal tension there. Obama was leaving the White House, and Egypt brought up this resolution at the United Nations Security Council to condemn Israel's illegal settlements. And New Zealand was on the Security Council at the time. And pressure from Israel meant Egypt dropped the resolution, and Israel thought it was all over. And then I think there was New Zealand and 2 other countries picked it up, and it went through the Security Council because America abstained rather than voted against it. So there are times when those, and Israel was just absolutely furious. They rang, Netanyahu rang our foreign minister, Murray McCulley, and said, "You've declared war on Israel. You've declared war on us." They were absolutely beside themselves. So there are those tensions around, but and universally, every Western leader hates Netanyahu. It's just, he's a nasty, vile person, but he knows how to manipulate certainly knows how to manipulate the pro-Israel lobby in the US, and to let the US know that its interests are Israel's interests, or the other way around. And I think what's happening now over Iran is a really critical thing, And New Zealand has got to. We say New Zealand's got to. New Zealand's got to. New Zealand should be standing up and saying this is a, if the US and Israel attack Iran, it's almost certain to be with tactical nuclear weapons, which is the only way you can break into the underground bunkers that Iran is using for its nuclear developments. I should say Iran is adamant they're not interested in a bomb. They simply want to be able to use nuclear power like any other country, and under the international law they have a right to do that. But now it's being whipped up, and we'll be told there'll be all this whipping up of anti-Iranian feeling. I think within the next few months, and we could well see, unless there's a real global movement to stop it, there'll be an attack on Iran, and that will be horrendous for the whole world.
All right, I'll read 2 questions from the Zoom, so 2 different people. First of all, this is to Patrick. It says, "Thank you for your contribution to the discussion. It's much appreciated. You raised the concept of super profits and the consequent buying off of the working class in developed capitalist nations. The theory of the labour aristocracy has certainly generated extensive debate over the past century. If this theory offers a valid explanation for the conservatism often observed among workers in the core capitalist countries, how do we then account for the fact that much of the contemporary left appears to be composed predominantly of individuals from the middle strata of class society, groups that in theory are even more directly positioned to benefit from imperial super profits than the lower strata of the working class?" So that's maybe a question for Patrick. And then there's a question to all the speakers, which says, how do you distinguish between the different stages of imperialism as manifested in colonialism or industrialization, national capitalism, and neoliberalism or globalization? Are they progressive manifestations of the same imperialist process, or does imperialism as an extension of the capitalist market only exist as a specific historical stage? If so, are we past or still remain in the age of imperialism? I would contend imperialism is a feature of national capitalism which has been superseded by globalization, and consequently potentially techno-feudalism. Imperialism must be understood as the transition process to the global economy, but cannot be conflated with the resultant global economy itself. I believe to conflate issues of globalization with imperialism is not helpful in highlighting the entrenchment of imperialist structures today. They are no longer being expanded. Their maintenance has fostered a new economic system with new practical affordances and restrictions.
Thanks. Would you like to lead off on the super profit?
Yeah, I'll try. As far as I gather, the question is sort of asking because of theories like talking about the labor aristocracy in the global north, and how upper stratums of the working class in the global north benefit from imperial super profits. Why is it that parts of the radical left in the Western world or in the global north are primarily made up of upper stratums instead of lower stratums of the working class? Good question. think part of that I would say is well, first I would say that be more skeptical about the presence of an organized working class against capitalism, whether that exists or not in the Western world. I think I'm more skeptical of that. And the other thing that's connected to it is the lower stratum of the working class are not organized and are not don't have like a socialist movement behind them because there is no Communist Party to take up their cause, I guess is what I would say. And to explain how more people are Marxists that are more petit bourgeois, I would say that's because we have more time. I come from the same background. We have more time. It's basically what it is. We have more time to read Marxist theory and be in reading groups, go to conferences, and be radicalized in that way. So when there is not an organized working class movement, those individualistic ways of radicalizing yourself become easier if you have more means, more economic means. Yep.
Thank you.
I'd agree with what Patrick said there. The working class structures were smashed by the Employment Contracts Act, by Labour and National, these successive policies, and I think you can look at lots of examples, and I might raise the issue of the vaccine mandates here, or say vaccinations. Back in the 60s, if this issue had come up, should we be vaccinated and what have you, there would have been within the working class movement, within trade unions, there would have been fierce debate, fierce discussion about it. People would have been tub thumping, and there might even been a few fist fights. Who knows? The point is, people would have really argued and debated it, because in those days there was a working class structure. There was the culture of the working class was really a part of our society in a very real way. And those things, we wouldn't have seen the development of all sorts of conspiracy theories. They would have been battled out in trade union meetings and on work sites. But we don't have that now, so we end up with that sort of fragmented situation that Patrick talked about. And just on the second question, I'm not sure about all the, I'm not sure it's helpful to get into all this discussion about different aspects of capitalism and imperialism. I think the thing is, what we have to accept is that capitalism is adaptable. It's very adaptable, and it has adapted to different things at different times. Between the 1930s and the 1980s, we had I grew up in. My parents went through the Depression. I was a baby boomer, and we just accepted the welfare state, high quality health, high quality education. That was what we accepted because that was what we thought was normal. And then, and we got those things because the working class fought for them and got them, fought for them and demanded them and got them, right? And around the Western world. And in the 1930s to the 1980s, as Piketty tells us, that's the exception in the history of capitalism, the absolute exception. The rest of the time, going back hundreds of years and where we are now, it's always been accumulation of wealth by a tiny number of people at the expense of everyone else. So we lived through this what we thought was a relatively good time for workers in those 50 years, but they were the absolute exception. Capitalism will roll with the punches, and then it will come back, and it won't be dead till it's dead.
The thing is with capitalism is it's so much products and exploitation and Chinese factories is dumped in the ocean, and that's what's really wrong, which is actually worse than communism. It requires that real fine balance.
Thank you. Now, Would you find it helpful to reiterate that second question that was put through? If you didn't have anything to say, no. Would you like to answer the
second question?
Yeah.
Oh, well, yeah, no, I think the person was suggesting that capitalism perhaps is superseding the nation state and it's moving to a new level. And that was a really popular idea, I remember. Very, very popular late 90s, sort of early 2000s when I was at university. And associated with the book Empire by Negri and Hart. And it was an idea that got tremendous play for a little while. And then 9/11 happened, and you didn't hear about it for a while. And I think the war on terror and subsequent events have just reiterated the continual reliance of capitalism on the nation state. And we're not. Doesn't look like we're seeing a more together world, does it? You know, the era of Trump is not an era where capitalism seems to be, you know, transcending nationalism, racism, war at all. So I think that possibly it's a slightly utopian idea.
But that's great, Scott, because it points out how ideas are refracted through imperialism, which kind of gets at the point that was in my question earlier that you guys were partly responding to, I think, that imperialism might be producing the grounds for how it's reflected in the left and how the left considers and understands itself.
Yeah.
And on that sort of note, I think that may well be a good point for us to finish unless there was any very quick. Okay, one more.
Very quick, it's not really a question. I just want to ask, he mentioned an organisation like an anti-imperialist, I think worldwide. Firstly, what is it, and is it active in New Zealand?
This is about ILPS, which is International League of People's Struggles.
Oh, okay.
They do have a website, and the what's it called? The charter and stuff are on the website, and they do have a presence here. WSA, couple of us from WSA, and there's some people in the room. There's our chair, Gabriella, is here. We went to Rotorua, and Johnny, and we went to Rotorua for the inaugural conference of ILPS Aotearoa last year in November. So it was just set up here, a national chapter, and currently there's like First Union, what other organizations? I believe PSNA is.
We are
in it, and Filipino mass organizations, Anak Bayan, Gabriela, Migrante, and Kotare, they're in it. If you want to add something? You're looking at me like you.
Organization alliance, so typically it's really only looking for organizations. Here the chapter in New Zealand only started last year, so it's quite new here. But those are the current and recent orgs that have made their expressions of interest to be a part of it. Yeah.
Cool.
Can I ask a question from the Zoom to round it out, if anyone wants to deliver their closing remarks to this? This is from Rebecca, who's in Dundee in Scotland. She asks, what actually is the point aim of anti-imperialism today? As I understand its use in Lenin's famous pamphlet, the concentration and consolidation of monopoly capital is an inverse image of the socialization of the means of production. Should there be a global socialist revolution? Likewise, the policy of national self-determination was conditioned on whether it would be advantageous to the spread of the October Revolution.
That reminds me of a story about the great New Zealand poet Kendrick Smithyman. He was on Norfolk Island in World War II, and it was a real centre of red activity. There was a lot of people forming Marxist study groups and different people around doing interesting things. They had nothing else to do on the island. And anyway, he said, I was sitting in the storeroom reading Lenin's theory of imperialism, and that was the end of my love affair with Marxism. I said, this bloke doesn't know what he's talking about. And I've got that's a slightly Philistine view, but I think there is a danger of having a very economistic and theoretical perspective and leaving out people's lived experience of imperialism, which comes to us as we're not just economic beings, it comes to us through culture, and it comes to us in many ways. And I think we need a multifaceted understanding of imperialism. So I would put someone like Lenin maybe on a reading list, Lenin and Imperialism. Then I would put next to him someone like James Belich, Replenishing the Earth, which tells the story of from the perspective of the settlers and their strange ideology about what they were going to do, the lived experience of the colonizer. I think we need to have more than an economic approach.
Just quickly, Becca added a follow-up point where she said, what does it mean to be an anti-imperialist in the 21st century? Do we think it's actually realistic to think of it in terms of socialist revolution anymore? And I'll just add to that I'm reminded of reading in high school history and social studies classes, like those old Punch cartoons from the 19th century, when it was basically liberals were opposing imperialism back then. So do we need socialism today to oppose imperialism?
Yeah, I think we do, and I think socialism is. I met with a Tongan friend yesterday, and he's going back he's almost put the finishing touches on a storehouse, and he's running a cooperative business, so that rather than having to buy things from Chinese capitalists, his village is going to be able to buy and distribute goods for themselves. And this is part of an overall economic development project, which is also seeing them running a sort of plantation which distributes its crops in terms of need. So it's part of a wider project. And I think that these things are real. And even if they're small scale, they can be very encouraging because they are real and concrete. They're not just lofty dreams.
Yeah, I'd say capitalism is really it's struggled at various times, and I think it's struggling now. And there's a sense in which people in New Zealand generally feel that capitalism isn't working, it's not delivering the goods. And even Winston Peters, dare I, quoting him quite a bit now, 2017 election, 2017 I think, yes, he said that when he made this, he does this, he negotiates with National Labour and he gives this big speech, and he said capitalism had failed New Zealand. It had failed New Zealand, New Zealanders as a whole. So I think it has. It's always been, capitalism. But as I said before, capitalism is very adaptable, but if you're going to have a critique, the critique is not so much of capitalism, but it's the critique and the failure of the progressive movement generally to come up with a coherent alternative. So I don't think we can blame the capitalists for that. We have to blame ourselves that we have not provided this alternative, which is so desperately needed, and it will be a socialist alternative, however that turns out.
Good question and good responses. I think, mostly resonate with what everyone's saying. I think we can look at imperialism as a question of economic sovereignty of nations, and I would say that yes, we need socialism to uproot imperialism by the roots, because capitalism is why imperialism happens. But and this has implications for how we can be anti-imperialist today. There are also non-socialist movements that are fighting for economic sovereignty in a way that weakens the imperialists, and I also think we need to support those as well.
Yes,
Yep. That's all I have to add.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the contributions of all the panelists tonight. It was very insightful, and if I could just ask you all to join us one more round of applause for everyone that's spoken.
it's a Platypus tradition to join us for beers at the pub afterwards. So we're either going to go to Shadows, if we can stomach it, or this place called The Fiddler, this Irish bar in Victoria Street. So you're more than welcome to come join if you like. And thank you for coming.
Thank you for the organizers.